I'm going to do it anyways. John hasn't heard it, so we'll go with it. So welcome to Protect Geauga Park's first virtual conservation conversation in the form of a webinar. We've never done this before, and so we're experimenting on you. And we'll be glad to hear your opinions afterwards on what we did right or did wrong. As you know, Protect Geauga Parks is a not-for-profit conservation organization. We were formed in 2015. Our mission is to promote, support, and actively campaign for conservation, preservation, and protection of nature as the primary mission of our parks. We believe that the common sense standard should be used for all decisions regarding use of parkland, with changes and additions done only with careful consideration and complete transparency by a thoughtful and qualified park board. We work to fulfill our mission by engaging in advocacy for the protection of our natural resources, for legislation that supports our mission, and for transparency from the governing agencies that manage our parks. We engage in education by hosting public education sessions, such as this one, posting articles on our website, Facebook, and email list. We cannot protect our natural resources if we don't educate ourselves and the public on what natural resources are in our area, what are the threats to those natural resources, and how can we best protect them. A little short advertisement, we will have another webinar coming up on September 30th, and we'll be giving you some information about that before the end of the program. We also have 2 grants that we're awarding from Protect Geauga Parks that you will be able to get information from on our website. We're giving out 2 teacher grants as well as our Bob McCullough Memorial Conservation Scholarships, as we've done in the past. So we'll have information on our website, and we'll give you that website before the end of this session. But enough about Protect Geauga Parks. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. We have John Sabin, founder and director of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And I can tell you he's a very patient person because he's been helping us practice using the Zoom. We couldn't have done it without him. So thank you, John. Also, thank you to Ann Jacobson for hosting this. She is our Zoom host and our Zoom captain tonight. John, I'm gonna have you introduce yourself. You know more about yourself than I do. I know that you have your own story to tell. I'm going to just do a little housekeeping. We're asking participants, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. And throughout the chat, we might be adding a few comments to that, but use the Q&A rather than the chat for questions, if that's okay. And with that, I'm pleased to announce John Sabin. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Barb, and thank you to Protect Geauga Parks for welcoming me and inviting me here tonight. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself in just a minute, but I first want to begin sharing some slides with you. And my slides are not there.
They were there a minute ago.
They were. So I'm going to work on getting my slides while I talk to you. First of all, I'm not the founder and director of Citizens Climate Lobby. I am the, I did start the Oberlin chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, but Citizens Climate Lobby was founded in 2007 by a man named Marshall Saunders. And CCL is now an international organization. So I certainly did not start this international organization, and I'm not the director. Okay, I'm getting close to finding my slides. So we're tracking them down here. Okay, I think I can pull them up now. Apologize for that. And there we go. Okay. So I didn't know about Protect Geauga Parks until I was invited to give this talk. And so I looked up the organization, and I saw your mission statement, which Barb has already read. And I was struck by this, this statement, to promote, support, and actively campaign for conservation, preservation, and protection of nature as the primary purpose of our parks. And I think that this mission very closely aligns with the mission of Citizens Climate Lobby. especially if we understand this word nature as including human beings and in fact the entire web of life on this planet. We cannot separate out one little bit of the interconnected web of life. It's all living things. We all depend on each other. So in order to protect the Geauga parks, we need to protect the entire interconnected web of life that the parks belong to. And that's what CCL is focused on, stopping climate change. I am one of the Great Lakes regional coordinators for Citizens Climate Lobby. And our Great Lakes region is Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And I'm one of the Ohio state coordinators for Citizens Climate Lobby. I've also been a social worker for 30 years, mostly in mental health as a psychotherapist. And I still do that part-time. And I've worked also in hospice and palliative care as a social worker. Before I get into the rest of my talk, I want to do a brief overview of some really basic climate science, just to give some context for the rest of what I want to say. So this is very basic, but the basic idea of climate science is that when sunlight hits the earth, some of it is reflected back out into space as light, and some of it is trapped by greenhouse gases as heat, which stays within the Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is the primary one of these greenhouse gases, although there are others. And we need these greenhouse gases in order for the surface of the planet to be warm enough to sustain life. If we didn't have that layer of greenhouse gases, then the Earth would just be a big ice ball. But luckily we have these gases that trap some of the sunlight as it's transformed into heat, and that makes the surface of the planet warm enough to sustain life. But what happens if we started adding more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere? This is what human beings have been doing now since the Industrial Revolution, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels. There are other things that we do which contribute to global warming, such as cutting down forests, but it is the burning of fossil fuels that is adding a layer of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And you can see how dramatically this burning of fossil fuels has increased over time. And the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now higher than at any point in human history. This is like, if the first layer of carbon dioxide is like a cozy blanket when you lie down to take a nap, imagine if someone put another blanket on you and then another blanket and another blanket and another blanket. Pretty soon it would get too warm. And that's what's happening to the planet. And we see this now in these massive wildfires in California, Oregon, and Washington. We have yet another massive hurricane bearing down on the Gulf states tonight. This is climate change, and it's happening now, not in some distant future. What I'm saying here is not just my opinion. This is the scientific consensus on global warming. There have been repeated reviews of the scientific literature of climate scientists, and repeatedly 97% of all the papers published in the field of climatology agree that global warming is happening, that is caused by human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels. And there's even been a review of the 3% of papers that don't agree, and those 3% of research papers can be demonstrated to be wrong. They're full of demonstrable errors. So this is a completely solid scientific consensus. If you hear anybody say that there's any kind of scientific debate or controversy about this, that is simply not the case. Climate scientists agree this is happening and this is caused by human activity. Now, having said that, I'd like to ask you to think about what it is that you think you can do personally, or maybe that you are already doing to help solve this problem of climate change. And if you would, I'd like you to just add those things in the chat as you think of them. And Barb and Ann, I'm not able to see the chat while I'm sharing my screen. So if you can see the chat, maybe you could read out some items that you see appearing there in the chat.
Okay, so could you say again the question that you asked people to write?
The question is, oh, and I'm sorry, I am able to see the chat. The
Okay.
question is, what are some things, and it's right there on your screen, that you can do personally or that you're already doing to help solve the problem of climate change?
Okay.
And what I see now is one person is a vegan, someone else is practicing reduce, reuse, and recycle. That's what I see so far. What else? Shop close to home, that's right, driving your car less. Writing representatives, very good. Are there other things? Still thinking? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and just tell you my story a little bit and how I came to be involved in Citizens Climate Lobby. Those things that were in the chat are important, of course. You know, recycling, not eating meat, not driving your car so much. These are important things. The problem is, of course, that in order to solve a global problem, we need to have not just a few people make some personal lifestyle changes. We need every economy in the world to transition to clean energy in a very short period of time. This is a very daunting problem. So how do we go from like individuals making some personal lifestyle changes to planetary change? I see some more things popping up here: solar energy and wind power, boycotting the fast fashion industry, right? Sustainable appliances. These are all wonderful. So as I said, I'm a social worker, mostly working in mental health. And I sort of vaguely remember becoming aware of climate change in the 1990s. I don't know when I first heard about it. But you know, I don't have any background in environmental science or, you know, policy making or economics or any of the things that seem relevant to solving a problem as big as this. I really became concerned in 2006 when I saw Al Gore's first movie, An Inconvenient Truth. That was a very alarming film. And so I was doing these sorts of things, you know, recycling, composting. I couldn't afford a car like the Prius, but I bought the most energy efficient gas-powered car that I could find, you know, changing light bulbs in the house, you know, these sorts of things. And, you know, I thought it was my responsibility to vote for politicians who, you know, would support some kind of climate action. So I was doing that. And I even got involved in some political campaigning, knocking on doors. And I was giving money to various environmental groups, Greenpeace, 350.org, the Sierra Club. Really, any environmental group that sent me like a request for money, I'd give them some money. I didn't have that much money to give as a social worker, but I'd be given $20 here and $20 there. And I really thought that the government would be working with scientists to figure out a solution to this problem. And, you know, very slowly, it seemed like maybe that was happening. Too slowly, but, you know, but there seemed to be some movement in that direction. And then when the Paris Climate Accord was signed, I was thought, okay, good, we're really moving towards some kind of global action here. And then in 2016, when we elected someone president who said that climate change is a hoax, it really hit me hard that the government was not poised to solve this problem. And at that point, I felt that what I was doing, you know, giving money to these environmental groups and the small personal changes that I could make, it just seemed inadequate to me. I just thought this is not enough. I need to be more involved in this. Nobody else is doing, you know, like it's not happening, right? So I did a Google search on the phrase climate change volunteer, and up came information about this organization, Citizens Climate Lobby. And frankly, that changed my life. So Citizens Climate Lobby, I read, is a volunteer-driven organization. There are very few paid staff at CCL. I think there are maybe 50 some paid staff members, and there are, say, 180,000 volunteers, something like that. Not all of those volunteers are active, but nevertheless, you can see the ratio of paid staff to volunteers is entirely skewed to the volunteers. The aim of Citizens Climate Lobby is empowering citizens to speak to their government. What I learned from CCL is that, I used to think that being an active participant in democracy means that I voted regularly, or even maybe that I worked on a campaign. But I learned from Citizens Climate Lobby that you can take another step and remain actively engaged with your elected representatives in between elections. CCL was inspired, this is kind of a side point, by an organization called Results, which was a global anti-poverty organization started by a man named Sam Daly Harris. And Sam Daly Harris said, every 2 years we elect our congressional representatives and then we abandon them. I always thought that was a great phrase, we abandon them. So Sam Daly Harris said we shouldn't abandon our representatives. We should stay in touch with them and let them know regularly what it is we want them to be doing in Washington. I also appreciated that Citizens Climate Lobby takes a nonpartisan approach. I felt then, and I still feel, I think like so many of us, just really sick of the partisan warfare in this country that really prevents serious problems from getting solved. And I think that the partisan divide is one of the biggest barriers, if not the largest barrier, to effective climate action in this country. Citizens Climate Lobby works very hard to bring conservatives and liberals together on this issue, and I appreciated that very much. The basic strategy of CCL is to put chapters of volunteers in every congressional district around the country, and then for each chapter to develop a friendly and respectful relationship with their own members of Congress, and in doing so, influence the decision-making of those members of Congress. CCL now has chapters in something like 90% of the congressional districts around the country. And every district in Ohio is now covered. So we're getting pretty close to our goal of 100% coverage. And I especially love this when I found out that CCL only has one rule. And they said, the one rule of CCL is to treat all people with respect, appreciation, and gratitude. When I read that, I just thought, this organization is for me. This has just felt so harmonious to what I believe in. So, reading about CCL on November the 15th, 2016, I was almost immediately hooked and I joined. And I wouldn't have guessed that, less than 4 years later, I'd be one of those few paid staff people as one of the Great Lakes regional coordinators. So CCL also has a piece of legislation that they are promoting. And before it was legislation, it was an idea for legislation. It is, I think, a simple and elegant idea. And it's what CCL considers the first best step in fighting climate change. It's not the only step. It's not the last step. But we say it is the first best step. And it's called carbon fee and dividend. The basic idea of carbon fee and dividend is to charge a steadily rising fee on carbon emissions at the source. So at the source means at the mine head, at the oil well, or at the port of entry, wherever fossil fuels are entering the marketplace, fossil fuel companies would pay a fee. That fee begins small, so it does not shock the economy, but every year that fee will go up at a predictable rate. And that sends a signal to the economy. Everybody knows that fossil fuels are gradually getting more and more and more expensive. And that means everybody has to begin planning ahead and figuring out how to gain access to cleaner, cheaper energy instead. And that transitions the whole economy, at least of the United States, to clean energy and away from fossil fuels. And what do you do with the money that you gather from this fee? The idea of carbon fee and dividend is you take this money and you return it to households, all of it, except for a small amount that you use to cover administrative costs. And you give that back to people in the form of equal monthly dividends. It turns out that if you give the money back equally to all Americans, that low-income people come out ahead financially. And the highest income people suffer a small income loss. That's because low-income people have smaller carbon footprints than high-income people. And also because if you return equal dividends, that money is a larger share proportionally for a low-income person than it is for a high-income person. So it becomes a progressive dividend, even though they're equal shares. It has a progressive impact and financially benefits low-income people. These 2 points, by the way, are what CCL calls their 2 red lines in determining whether we would support any climate policy. Does it drive down emissions effectively? And does it protect low-income people? This approach does both of those things. There's a third piece that's necessary to make this work, and that is a border adjustment. That is a tariff on goods that come from other countries that do not have a similar carbon price. This means that there'd be no advantage for an American company to go overseas and pollute more cheaply, in some other country. They couldn't do that because they have to pay that tariff at the US border anyway. So they might as well stay here. And the other beautiful thing about this border adjustment is if other countries don't have a carbon price like this, they have an incentive to implement one. Otherwise, they're going to pay a tariff at our border and give money that's going to go right into the pockets of American citizens. And who's going to want to do that? And so what you have here, as I said, is this really simple, elegant design that not only drives down US emissions and protects low-income people, but it creates an incentive for global action, and that's what's necessary. In 2019, in the Wall Street Journal, a statement was published by a group of economists recommending carbon fee and dividend as an approach to solving climate change. This letter has now been signed by over 3,500 economists. It is the largest public statement of the professional economists in history. The signatories on this letter include 27 Nobel laureates, 4 former chairs of the Federal Reserve, 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors, and 2 former secretaries of the US Department of the Treasury. That would be George Shultz and Jim Baker, by the way, who both served under Ronald Reagan. So this is what CCL was campaigning, lobbying on this idea for a long time. But then in late 2018, it became a piece of legislation in the US Congress, in both chambers of Congress, with bipartisan support in both chambers of Congress. And yes, we did celebrate. It was right at the end of a congressional session, though. So this was actually in the lame duck. It was after the elections and before the seating of a new Congress. And what that means is that this bill that was introduced in late 2018 actually died at midnight on December 31st, unfortunately. And so then the bills had to be reintroduced. And the bill was reintroduced in the House in early 2019. It has not yet been reintroduced in the Senate. In the House, the bill currently has 82 co-sponsors, including Republican Francis Rooney of Florida. I'm sad to say he's the only Republican sponsoring the bill currently. We're delighted to have one Republican on the bill. We certainly were hoping for more Republicans to join, but this is where we're at. Unfortunately, Francis Rooney is retiring, so he won't be in Congress next year. So as I said, we work hard to bring Republicans and Democrats together. I mentioned that 2 former secretaries of the Treasury under Ronald Reagan have both supported this type of legislation. So there is conservative support for this type of legislation, but so far not clearly in Congress. How does this bill work? Well, it puts a fee on fossil fuels at the source, $15 per ton of carbon emissions in the first year. That's about like raising the price of gas at the pump about 15 cents a gallon. And then every year that price would go up by $10 per ton. So imagine that's another 10 cents per gallon, if you want to think about how that might impact you personally. 100% of the net revenue, that's the revenue minus administrative costs, are returned to households as equal monthly dividends. Administrative costs, by the way, are capped at 8% of total revenue in the first 5 years, and then it drops to 2% of total revenue after that. So really almost all of this money is going back to households. There is a carbon border adjustment, as we had proposed in the original carbon fee and dividend idea. And then, of course, once this becomes a bill, this is out of our hands now, because now there's congressional, as they say, sausage making that goes on. And in order to gain Republican support when the bill was first introduced, there was a deal was negotiated, and congressional Republicans wanted to know that there would not be regulation of greenhouse gases on top of the fee. And the Democrats involved in that negotiation agreed to that. So this was not in our original proposal, but in the bill, the EPA cannot have new regulations of greenhouse gas emissions for 10 years. If after 10 years, the emissions reductions are not meeting the targets, which are specified in the bill, the EPA is then mandated to add regulations, which will bring emissions reductions into line with the targets that are specified in the bill. CCL is okay with this provision because we believe that the fee will drive down emissions without any regulation, which is what we've always been saying to Republican congresspeople anyway, that we can do this without regulation if we put this fee into place. So the bottom line here is that the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act reduces US emissions 90% by 2050. That's not just a wish, that is actually in the bill. This is required by the bill. So, and there are mechanisms in the bill to make sure that this happens. If the emissions reductions are not on target, not only does the EPA get involved, but the amount of the fee increase every year will change, so that the fee will go up by a larger amount if necessary to get our emissions in line with this 90% reduction by 2050. Now, we really need to get to 100% reduction globally by 2050. So this is not enough, but 90% reduction in US emissions by 2050 with a single piece of legislation is pretty darn good. We believe that most low-income people will gain financially. In fact, a study that was recently released, commissioned by Citizens Climate Lobby, projects that 96% of the lowest income quintile will come out ahead financially with the implementation of this bill. The bill does have conservative and liberal support. Like I said, not necessarily in the halls of Congress just yet, but we certainly have conservative support outside of Congress and liberal support. According to another study done by this group, REMI stands for Regional Economic Models, Inc., this legislation will create 2.8 million new jobs in 20 years. So it's good for the economy. A lot of times you hear, oh, we can't do this, climate change legislation because it'll hurt the economy. Well, that's not true. This will be good for the economy. And finally, it will incentivize global cooperation. Just a wonderful, wonderful set of features. And this I love. The cost to implement this legislation is $0. That's because the administration of the bill comes from the fee. So this pays for itself. Congress doesn't need to come up with any new money. There are some approaches to climate change which would be quite expensive. This costs nothing. So I think this is really, if Congress could spend no money and drive down US emissions by 90%, what are we waiting for? I want to tell you a little bit about how Citizens Climate Lobby works. We talk about operating through 5 levers of political will. And when we talk about political will, we say that it is citizens that create political will. Congress responds to it. And so it is our responsibility as citizens to create political will. I've actually heard one member of Congress say to us, make us do it. You have to make us do it, right? You have to be so insistent that this is what you want. This is what the people want, that there's no way that Congress can refuse to do it. This is our job. You know, we've heard that Congress actually gets relatively few phone calls and other messages about climate change. So as long as that's true, and you know, you see people ranking like, how important is climate change to you? Recently, actually, in the last few years, climate change is among the top 3 issues for many voters. But you probably know that for the last 10 years, and before that, that was not true. Climate change should be at the bottom of the list of any list of concerns. So only recently has climate change come to the top of those lists. Anyway, how do we work on building political will? We work through these 5 levers. The first one is lobbying. So that means we have meetings with our members of Congress, we call them, we email them, so we have direct contact with members of Congress. We also work through media. We write letters to newspapers, we work through social media, we work through radio and television to get our message out and to make sure that this conversation about climate change is in sort of the public view. We do grassroots outreach. We do presentations like this one I'm doing tonight. When we're not in the middle of a pandemic, we do tabling events at you know, any kind of a festival or a fair. We might be there with a table with literature about our work and signing up new volunteers. We do grass tops outreach, where we try to get business leaders, faith leaders, and other community leaders to support our work and to amplify our message with Congress. And finally, we focus on chapter development, which is taking care of the health and the well-being of the chapter itself, making sure that our volunteers are educated and that we are connected to each other and that we support each other. I told you before, Citizens Climate Lobby was founded by this man, Marshall Saunders. Marshall died last December, a big loss for our organization. I just want to end with some of Marshall's words. Marshall said, ordinary people like you and me have to organize, educate ourselves, give up our hopelessness and powerlessness, and gain the skills to be effective with our government. And finally, I want to play you a little clip of Marshall speaking so you can have a sense of how he inspired us.
I used to think that the important people were taking care of the important problems. I don't think that anymore.
What we're trying to do is do the impossible by proving that regular people who have regular jobs can have more influence in Washington, D.C. than people who can write gigantic checks.
Once you understand the concept of pricing carbon, you realize that there really is something that is almost equivalent to the silver bullet to mitigate climate change, but that you are going to have to fight for it.
We are building an army, a peaceful army. And our weapons are truth and nonviolence, and as we keep saying over again, respect and admiration for those who would oppose us. You and I are engaged in a battle for all of life. All of life. Not just humankind, but for all of life. I don't see anybody else coming. You know, when you get in a dire situation, the cavalry shows up, right? Well, I'm sure of it. You are the cavalry. We are the cavalry. And we're going to win. And there's no choice about it. There's no choice. We're going to win.
So thank you again for inviting me. If any of you would like to join Citizens Climate Lobby, you can go to our website where you can read more about us, citizensclimatelobby.org, and there's a place where you can join there. Or if you're really eager, you can text the word join right at this minute to 619-675-7507. This is my contact information. If you'd like to reach out to me later, I'm happy to talk to any of you about the work that we do and how you can get involved or any other question that you might have.
John, can you see the questions in the Q&A?
Let me see what's in the Q&A. No, but I'm going to stop sharing, I guess, while we do the Q&A, and then maybe they'll become apparent to me. Yeah, now I can see Q&A.
Okay. They're all yours.
Okay. So first question I see is about recycling. Recycling is very problematic right now. I suppose you've all heard about that. I'm not an expert in recycling, but I have read that there's been a breakdown in the whole system where my understanding is China stopped wanting to take our poor quality recycling from the United States. And Americans don't want to learn how to recycle better. And so now there's a glut of this material and there's no market for it. But I'm sure you can do some research about that. Have we passed a tipping point? No, I don't believe we've passed a tipping point. Climate scientists that I know who've spoken to CCL say, no, it is not too late. We are certainly in a lot of trouble. I mean, if we could drop our emissions to zero tonight, we're still in a lot of trouble because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a long time, which means not only do we need to stop putting it into the atmosphere, we have to find a way to get it out of the atmosphere. Now, there are ways of doing that. I mean, some of it is quite natural. There are ways of farming that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And there are some technologies that are being developed to actually suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. I don't think we're yet in a position to deploy those kind of technologies widely, but that is a problem. And I think, clearly we are going to suffer from the effects of climate change, probably for the rest of our lives. But that doesn't mean that we can't turn it around. I don't know climate scientists who are saying we can't turn this around. Do we support the Green New Deal? Well, we are delighted that the Green New Deal is out there and that it has really brought climate change very strongly into the public conversation. The Green New Deal takes a little different approach than we do, and that's fine. There are a lot of environmentalists doing a lot of different kinds of work, and it's all overlapping. You have, there are people out there blocking the Keystone XL pipeline or turning off pipelines or advocating for a really broad policy like the Green New Deal, which addresses healthcare and housing and income inequality and climate change. And we're grateful for all of that. CCL is one of those organizations working to solve climate change. And we see that the proponents of the Green New Deal as allies. So, yeah, I mean, we have our own role. Yeah, we like to say that there's an ecosystem of environmental groups. And like any ecosystem, each organism has their own niche in that ecosystem. And our niche, our place in the ecosystem is to be narrowly focused on bipartisan carbon fee and dividend legislation. That's what we do. That's what we specialize in. If we do see some sort of new Green New Deal developing in Congress, which seems like not too far-fetched a possibility next year, depending on the outcome of the election, CCL will simply advocate that carbon pricing, preferably that looks like carbon fee and dividend, be part of that Green New Deal, because we understand from the experts that carbon pricing is the single most effective thing that we can do to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going to advocate for that. Do we have a chapter in the 14th district? Well, we certainly do. We have a chapter in Twinsburg that is in the 14th district. And if you're interested in joining that, well, there's a couple things you can do. If you join Citizens Climate Lobby, you are automatically connected to the closest chapter to where you live. Sometimes you, for some reason, maybe you want to join a different chapter. I mean, and maybe it's the way the districts kind of overlap and where the chapters are and so forth. So if you get assigned to a chapter, you really want to be in the Twinsburg chapter, but you got assigned to the Cleveland chapter, or we have a Mahoning Valley chapter, you can reassign yourself. There's a place on the website where you can reassign your chapter. And if you have questions about that later, please email me and I can help you to get connected. Dave Joyce, by the way, is a member of what's called the Climate Solutions Caucus in the House, which is one of CCL's proudest achievements, is that we have facilitated the creation of a caucus in both the House and Senate, where Republicans and Democrats come together to talk about climate change solutions. And Dave Joyce is one of the Republican members of that caucus in the House. What is Biden's climate change position, and would he help CCL? Well, I don't know all the details of Biden's climate plan. I can tell you that his plan does not include carbon pricing. Carbon pricing generally refers to the idea of making carbon emissions more expensive. And there are a variety of ways of doing that. Carbon fee and dividend is just one of those ways. You've probably heard of cap and trade. That's another way of doing carbon pricing, for example. I understand that Biden's plan that he's released does not include any kind of carbon pricing. If Biden were elected, we would certainly be working with his administration, as I said, and lobbying members of Congress, asking them to include carbon pricing. Why? Because the experts tell us it is the single most effective thing we can do to drive down carbon emissions. I don't know. This is a guest David, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Legate's appointment to NOAA. I've only just seen a headline about this. Apparently there's a climate denier who's been appointed to the government agency NOAA. Well, you know, this is very concerning. Like I said, I don't know details, but generally speaking, we still have some pretty powerful opponents. We have people who are still pushing hard against climate action. You know, it's a funny thing, because I think the oil and gas industry is actually starting to come to terms with the fact that they need to get on board with this solution. Although I think at the same time, you'll often find the oil and gas industry putting money into campaigns to block climate action, or even to continue disseminating misinformation. You know, we're up against some really powerful, wealthy interests, you know, people who make money from fossil fuels. It's really tough. But we do have allies in the oil and gas industry also. And I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, except that we just keep fighting. We just keep fighting. How do we deal with unbelieving representatives? Most of our conversations in Congress these days, we very rarely hear any member of Congress say they don't believe in climate change. They just don't say that to us. Sometimes they say things in public that are a little more skeptical than what they say to us in private. It's a really interesting thing to go talk to members of Congress in person, because you get a whole different side of them. I live in Oberlin. My member of Congress is Jim Jordan. And his public persona, I mean, I don't want to offend anybody if Mr. Jordan has any supporters here in the audience, but you know, his public persona doesn't particularly seem that friendly to a group of liberal environmental activists from Oberlin, Ohio. But we did meet with him once in person. We've met with his staff many times. We actually met with Mr. Jordan himself in person once. And we consider the content of those conversations to be confidential, so I won't tell you about the content of the conversation, but I will tell you that in person he was respectful and warm, thoughtful. He asked good questions, he took notes, he listened. I mean, it was not, I think, what any of us expected. And it was one of the things that was a real eye-opener for me in terms of the value of direct lobbying and directly meeting with members of Congress and working to build on those relationships. It is so easy in our society right now that we demonize each other. I think it's only when we kind of get up close and personal that we have a chance of finding out, like, oh, this is a person. It's a human being, you know? And the fact is that all of us, all of our families, all of our children and grandchildren, everyone's lives are at stake here. And we have to come together as human beings who share the same home, because that's the reality. And what are we doing to help repeal HB 6? That's an interesting question. Well, Citizens Climate Lobby does not usually get involved in state level policy. We're focused on federal action, but we do get involved sometimes in state level action if we think that there's something useful that we could do. And it occurred to me as one of our Ohio state coordinators that the HB 6 scandal created an opportunity to kind of open up the conversation about energy policy in Ohio and what it should look like. And so we actually have asked our volunteers around the state to write to state legislators and ask for the repeal of HB 6. It's kind of an unusual thing to do and a little bit controversial. And frankly, I'm a little uncomfortable with that we did that. Like, it doesn't quite sit with me perfectly, just because in CCL we say that we stand for solutions, not against anything. Like we're trying to be like a really positive organization. But I think that the repeal of HB 6 is inevitable, and it's such a strange kind of mashup of a bill. But we're doing more than just calling for the repeal of HB 6. We've been meeting with other environmental organizations around the state, and we're in the process of trying to develop a framework for energy policy going forward, a set of principles that could guide the legislature in forming new energy policy. And for example, the kinds of things that this is all a work in progress, but the kinds of things that might become part of a framework would be that Ohio energy policy should move towards zero carbon emissions by the year 2050, that our energy policy should protect low-income people and help to transition workers if they would be displaced by a transition to clean energy. So those are some ideas, like what are the basic guidelines? And then once we could establish guidelines, then we go talk to legislators and try to craft some policy with the state legislature. We probably won't go to the legislature directly until January, when we have a new legislature seated and we know exactly who's there. And we've heard too that there tends to be a little bit more of a bipartisan honeymoon in Columbus right after the election than right before it. So like right now, the bad partisan vibes are really heating up. And so it's not a great moment to go in and try to develop bipartisan support. And you need that bipartisan support in Columbus like you need it in Washington. Republicans have, what, a 2-to-1 majority at the state level, and they're likely to have something like that again next year. And so we need to be able to bring Republicans on board as well as Democrats. So we're doing putting in some groundwork now, but we hope to be active with the state legislature in the new year. Those are all the questions in the chat right now. We have any more questions? Well, I thank you all for being here. I'm going to share a couple things again in my slides before closing. I'm going to let Ann or Barb talk about Protect Geauga Parks again.
Well, I'm not one to stay silent. And you on this one, Nan?
Yes, I just
right.
put my video on and my microphone. So
I'm disappearing.
All right, that was quick. Well, I just want to thank John so much for a wonderful presentation. I've actually heard you once before, and that was what motivated me to ask you to come and speak on behalf of Protect Geauga Parks for our webinar tonight. And once again, I feel like the Citizens Climate Lobby is really a very potent strategy. I don't think the problems you don't make the problems sound easy, but you make getting involved sound very doable. And I know myself and probably a lot of other people feel helpless, like there's nothing we can do. And so this is, for myself, the single focus of this organization is very helpful because your chat at the beginning where people were giving out all these ideas of what we can do, and you know, that's all great, but like you said, there has to be more. And I loved what the founder said about how when there's important problems, you wait for the important people to come and fix them. and that hasn't happened. Boy, don't we know that. They've made them worse, I think. So thank you once again. If we had a different format where people could be applauding, I'm sure all of our participants would be putting their hands together right now and applauding. So I thank you so much. And I did put up in the chat box throughout the John's talk the addresses to the various organizations, John had it too, the CCL website. Oh, and I wanted to say too that after the first talk I heard John give, I did join CCL, so I'm a member now, and I think I'm in the Cleveland group, and I didn't realize I could change because I'm really probably closer to Twinsburg, and I kind of have that suburban mindset anyway, so maybe I will switch off to that Twinsburg group, but I'll look into that. So thank you for mentioning that. I do want to say that we have coming up another conservation conversation, same format as tonight's, and that one is, as your screen shows, new strategies for conserving nature in Northeast Ohio when climate change will change everything. And our speaker, David Beach, is a very prominent local environmental activist and ecologist. He was the founder of Eco City Cleveland. He also has worked with the Green City Blue Lake Institute, the Sustainability Center of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And so he has developed a regional biodiversity vision that he helped develop for what's called LEAP, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Diversity. And the goal of that is to enhance the biodiversity of our habitats and ecosystems. So that should be a really good presentation. If you go to our website, the protectgeaugaparks.us website, you can get the registration information there. Or there's that link there. If you want to copy and paste that can link you directly in, but that link will also be on our website. And also I had put up in the chat box what our email address is. If you want to shoot us an email, we can send you whatever information you want. And also you can ask to join our email list, which is a really useful list. We don't bombard you. We only very selectively send out very key things and keep you informed of things you might want to be involved in, like tonight's presentation and the one next week. So with that, Barb, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, thank you everybody for coming. John, this was great. Thank you. And thanks for putting up with our getting the kinks out of our presentation. I think we're on it now. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and hope to see you on the 30th, and hope that everybody between tonight and tomorrow joins CCL.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me. Good night all.
Good night.